Welcome. Good morning and whatever. Good evening to other people around the world. This is a very, very special day as we have the great opportunity, thanks to Madeleine Orr and Brian McCullough, to be co-hosting this special Earth Day series with the Sport Ecology Group. And just a little bit of background, the Sport Ecology Group is the global knowledge hub for all things sport and planet. And we're very grateful from the Sports Environment Alliance to be doing this special session. And it's also very special because we get to, in Australia, celebrate Earth Day a second day in a row, seeing that yesterday was our Earth Day. So happy 51st Earth Day to all of you. And I welcome all of you around the world by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we play, as well as acknowledging and paying respects to their elders, both past, present, and elders from other communities who are also with us, who have long cared for the land upon which we play, and we join you in that journey for environmental stewardship. And we are very fortunate to have these three very experienced researchers here today to share their knowledge about what playing in future generations look like, what is to expect with the climate affected world that we will be playing in, and then as well what sport must consider as far as what are the risks, the opportunities, and what is going to be a warmer world, a colder world, extreme weather conditions all over the place. And for us in this part of the world, we really understand this, as you would have been aware last year, having seen Australia on fire, and as well images across sport in cricket with smog in the background. And then in 2017 for tennis, and also other years where it's been reaching record high temperatures. The fact that heat plays such a big role in affecting the way that we play and how we respond to that. And so we're very, very, very lucky to have these three gentlemen with us, and I'd like to introduce them to you. So first we have Dr. Greg Dingle. In the top left, he's the lecturer at LaTrobe, sometimes my boss when I am working at LaTrobe. I know he's a fair boss. And as well, he is a Sport Ecology Group member. And so happy to have you here. He's a leading researcher in sport and planet matters, in particular climate change and how that affects facilities. And then just management in general. We have Dr. James Smallcombe, who's now in the top left corner, who's a Post-doc Research Associate in a very long title area of the University, Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney. And that part is obviously the smallest part of this title. We're so delighted to have you here so that you can educate people like me who, yes, I've had some sports medicine background, but I'm guessing you're far more advanced than I am in understanding how this will be affecting the people who play. And then last but not least, top left is Dr. Blair Trewin. Lucky for the Sports Environment Alliance family, we've been able to see you twice, seeing that you kicked off our November Sea Summit events last year. So thank you, Blair, for coming back. He's a senior research scientist climatologist at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. And not only is he looking at what the weather is today, but as well with the climate and how it's changing for us. So to start, I'd love to ask you, Blair, to give us a lay of the land. What does the climate science today tell us about climatic warming at a global scale? And if you can then give us a little bit of local flavor of what that means for us in Australia.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's thanks for the introduction, and clearly it will come as no surprise to anyone here that we are seeing sustained global warming, and we're expected to see it continue into the future. We've seen warming of a bit over a degree globally since the late 19th century. That warming is actually stronger than that over most land areas. Warming is stronger on land than in the ocean. So many land areas have warmed by 1.5 to 2 degrees or even more since the late 19th century. And that the last 5 years have been the 5 warmest years on record, and that warming is likely to continue at least in the short term. One of the things with global warming is that it's driven largely by greenhouse gas emissions, but the time lag between a change in emissions profile and what that does to the climate is a couple of decades, because that's how long it takes for the oceans to catch up, essentially. So our path for the next 20 years or so is already fairly well set. The changes that may be made from here will make a big difference to what happens to the climate in the second half of the 21st century, whether we see stabilisation or further warming. But over the next couple of decades, whatever happens to greenhouse gas emissions, we can expect the climate to continue to warm at the rate of, likely a couple of tenths of a degree per decade. So the temperature side of things is fairly clear cut. When we get to other aspects of climate change, you see quite substantial regional differences. So if you're looking at things like total rainfall and changes in drought risk, then that varies quite a bit by region. So, for example, Southern Australia, particularly the southwest and the southwestern US, are seeing quite significant drying, whereas in many of the higher latitude parts of the northern hemisphere, as well as in parts of northern Australia, rainfall is increasing. And every sport, of course, is going to have its own risk profile, and sometimes that will vary by levels of the sport. And one significant issue with drought, for example, is that the professional sporting codes can usually still find a way to maintain their grounds, but at local level sport, often if they have significant water restrictions, for example, often really struggle to maintain ground. So you may not have such an impact on professional level sport, but at the grassroots level, you start to really struggle. We expect to see increased frequency of some types of extremes, particularly extreme rainfall. Other types of extremes, the evidence is not quite so clear, but it's clear that sport over the next few decades will be taking place against a backdrop of higher temperatures, which means increased heat stress on athletes. It means it's often more difficult to maintain facilities, and introduces quite a wide range of challenges for sport, as for all other areas of society.
Blair, that was really comprehensive. And just as an FYI, Blair also has been long involved in sport orienteering Australia. So I think it's something that's top of mind. So it was really great to hear your perspective on what that trickle down effect might mean. And I just wanted to highlight a few things, and maybe you could expand on it, just so the audience is across it. But you said 1 to 2 degrees, and for some people who aren't necessarily intimately reading about climate science, they might think that that's not a big deal. Can you just say a few words about what that actually means when it translates into conditions?
Yeah, well, it's you're right that it doesn't sound like a lot, but we also need to remember that a lot of the impacts of climate change come from what's happening at the extremes. And to give one example, thinking here of snow sports as an example. And if you have a 1 degree warming, that's going to lead to a shortening of the snow season. Exactly how much of a shortening it is will depend on how marginal your location already is. We see that already in Australia, that some of the more marginal lower altitude ski resorts, like your Mount Selwards and your Mount Baw-Baws, are already effectively almost non-functional, whereas the higher altitude ones have only been modestly affected to date. But when you think of 1 degree warming as not being very much, but if that 1 degree warming translates into a shortening by a month of the snow season, that's a real problem for snow sports. It's just one example.
Yeah, and I'm guessing you have 1,000 other examples as well, so that's a really good one, and I hope that's a good summary of what that really translates to. And I just also want to pull out something you also said about regionally affecting. So obviously you said in Australia, there will be parts of Australia where heat will become more important, more affecting and impacting of sports. And I'd like to then ask James, if you don't mind to, oh, and James has a question actually. Blair, go ahead, James, please.
If you wouldn't mind, just a quick question to Blair. Obviously, you've just alluded to this kind of 1 to 2 degree kind of shift in average surface temperature as a result of climate change. What kind of effect are we expecting in terms of acute heat wave events? Am I right in thinking the prevalence and severity of these acute, short-term extreme heat wave events is also likely to increase?
Yes, it's with an increase in mean temperatures, you see an increase in heat extremes. Exactly what form that takes varies quite a bit from place to place. In Australia, the generally speaking, the evidence is that extremes are warming probably at a fairly similar rate to summer averages, but there are some other parts of the world, and particularly Europe's a standout here, where summer extremes are warming faster than the averages, partly because there are feedbacks from soils drying out. So it's a particular area which needs to be watched. And I think one nice example of how overall warming is making a difference to extremes is I'll pull out a story from my own sporting career in 1991. I ran in a Junior World Championships in Berlin, and one of the races there was on what was at the time Berlin's hottest day on record. It was about 35.7 or thereabouts, and I remember that in the last I ran a fairly conservative first 2/3, and in the last part of the course was going through people left, right, and centre who had blown up in the heat. The follow-up to that is that over the last decade, Berlin now reaches those temperatures probably about every second summer.
Now that's so interesting, and it reminds me, that's a great question, James, and it reminds me actually the impetus behind this panel, which I should have said at the very beginning, was around the idea that, that question about will it be more frequent, like these bouts of extreme weather conditions. And I think the sentiment around the sport industry is quite like modular, like, oh, well, if it's in summer, we just make a policy that will cover that season or move in that situation. So we'll move the schedule a little bit back, but it doesn't mean that only those extreme weather conditions will only occur in that expected season of heat. Good point. And I think, administrators should be, thankfully you said that, we can be more savvy in terms of the development of policies that are sophisticated enough, that are nimble enough to take into account any event versus only making adaptations that fit within expected conditions.
Yeah, and I think it also needs to be remembered here that some of the, if you like, adaptation options that are available to to the big sporting organisations may not be available at grassroots level. Like an obvious adaptation is to play more at night, but obviously to be able to do that, you need the facilities to be able to do it. And you might be able to. You can certainly play cricket at night at the MCG, but you can't really play cricket at night at the the local oval in Manangatang.
Yeah, good point. And actually, I'll hold that thought, because Blair, I'll be asking Greg some questions about what that means for us in sport management and policy. And so that's a really good point. The emphasis on the community, sport community, and how they're going to deal with the community sports clubs. But I'd like to transfer what you said, Blair. Thank you so much for giving us that backdrop. I mean, if this is happening, and extreme weather conditions, including extreme heat, is starting to become much more frequent. James, your background is this thermo, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory, and thinking about exertional heat illness. Can you tell our audience what that is and what that means for us in implications for us in sport?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Just first of all, just good morning from Sydney. It's really nice to be on the panel today. Very interesting topic. And I think Blair really sets us up nicely with this background information, really sold the relevance of what we're doing today and why it's important now, but also why it's going to be even more important moving forward. So From my end of things, I just really wanted to touch on some very basic physiology to start with, just to kind of get us all up to speed. And as I think most of us are probably aware, us as humans, we need to kind of maintain a fairly tight internal body temperature. Now we typically sit when we're resting at about 37 degrees Celsius. This translates to about 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you in America. And it's really important that we don't deviate too far from this kind of optimal point. However, due to kind of our daily physical activity, we naturally produce heat. When we move our muscles and the processes that fuel those muscles, we produce metabolic heat. Now, this is unavoidable and completely normal. However, in order to avoid a gradual and progressive heating of our body, we utilize a number of different mechanisms through which we dissipate our body heat in order to keep us cool. Now, one of these mechanisms is the vasodilation of our blood vessels. So our blood vessels become wider and redirect hot blood towards the skin, where heat can be lost to the external environment. Now, this is very effective when the ambient temperature is cool, as heat moves down a temperature gradient from hot to cool spaces. But of course, as the air temperature increases, this avenue for heat dissipation becomes less effective. And that's obviously problematic during periods of hot weather. So with this in mind, when we're exercising in warmer environments, the primary means of human heat dissipation lies in our ability to secrete sweat. Now, when sweat is secreted from the sweat glands, it is released onto the skin surface, from which it then can evaporate. Now, it's this evaporative process that's key to human heat dissipation, as the evaporation of sweat liberates heat and therefore provides us with a really potent cooling effect. And now the evaporation of sweat is our most effective means of heat dissipation, especially during exercise. Now, one problem with this, though, is as the ambient humidity increases, it becomes much harder for that sweat that's secreted onto our skin to evaporate. Much more of a sweat then begins to drip. And when this happens, it provides much less of a cooling effect. And it therefore becomes much more difficult for us to keep our bodies at an optimal state of thermal homeostasis. We heat up. Now, this kind of links us to the notion of exertional heat illness. And this can affect athletes, whether they're professional or recreational, during exercise, especially if that exercise is of high intensity or of long duration, because we produce a lot of metabolic heat during that activity. And also, we're vulnerable to heat illness when the environmental conditions are severe. So when ambient temperatures are high or the corresponding relative humidity is also high. Now, when these environmental conditions become more challenging, we begin to store more heat than we can dissipate. And then we, as any object would, we gradually gradually begin to heat up. And this is normal, but when this heating up becomes excessive, we begin to run into problems. Now, heat illness is progressive and it can manifest in many different symptoms depending on the severity. Now, on the less severe end of the spectrum, people can experience kind of general feelings of fatigue or maybe even heat cramps, which may begin to negatively affect exercise performance. However, they tend not to leave any kind of lasting damage, providing you recover sufficiently after exercise. As we continue through the heat illness spectrum, we can begin to experience something called heat exhaustion. Now, again, while this doesn't typically result in any severe lasting damage, it can result in some fairly nasty symptoms. Now, people can experience very heavy sweating, they can begin to feel nauseous, they can begin to feel dizzy, and they can develop other symptoms such as headaches. So it's a pretty nasty experience, but if treated appropriately and people cool down sufficiently after exercise, the damage isn't long lasting. However, if this heat exhaustion is left unchecked and people continue to exercise and our body temperature continues to rise and we begin to rise past the 40 degrees Celsius mark, we can enter the realms of exertional heat stroke. Now, this is a term that's often bandied around, but it's often misapplied. Exertional heat stroke is a real medical emergency and it can be life-threatening. And this typically occurs when our body temperature exceeds around the 40.5 degrees Celsius mark. And it's characterized by internal cell damage. As our bodies heat up past this critical point, our cells begin to break down and our normal physiological processes begin to fail. This can result in really serious conditions such as kind of extensive organ failure, and in severe cases, it leads to death. So this is obviously a very serious matter. And if exertional heat stroke develops, as I said, it's a medical emergency. Ambulance personnel need to be called, and it's absolutely vital that the individual is called rapidly. So of course, this is something that we aim to avoid wherever possible.
James, that was a really, it was great to hear from start to finish, you know, the idea of what extreme heat can do to people who are participating in sport, and as well the definitions of certain conditions at different stages. And I'm guessing it would be really complicated area to create a policy for, but of course, Sport Medicine Australia has developed a set of guidelines. Can you tell us a little bit about the guidelines and how they were able to address creating a guidelines for policy like this? Because I'm guessing there's like lots of, you said, warning signs. And if you're not a medical practitioner or a professional, it'd be hard for sport administrators who are, like Blair talked about, you know, community sports being run by volunteers, be hard to identify.
Absolutely, yes. And the information I just provided just gives you kind of a background with the kind of the scene that we're dealing with. And the new Sports Medicine Australia guidelines were really designed to protect the Australian public engaging in exercise from those adverse health effects of heat stress exposure. And a key feature of these was that they're evidence-based guidelines based on up-to-date scientific research. And in these guidelines, we've tried to identify the safe limits for exercise participation. And importantly, we've tried to tailor these recommendations so they're both sport specific and therefore differentiate the needs of different athletes engaging in different sports. And really the key focus of these, or the aim of these guidelines, was to harness our understanding of the key factors that influence our risk of heat stress. And I've mentioned some of those already, but they can be summarized by the ambient temperature, the corresponding relative humidity. Now this is crucial. Temperature doesn't mean a great deal in terms of from a heat stress perspective, unless you know the relative humidity, because of the effect it has on sweat evaporation. But also importantly, equally important is the nature of the sport being played. Now, the key features here that I'm talking about are the exercise intensity and duration, as these influence our metabolic rate and the amount of heat our bodies generate, but also the clothing required during that sports participation. So we can think of some obvious examples of sports that require fairly heavy protective equipment. NFL is a good example. The cricket pads worn by batsmen. And just like, and these are important as they influence the amount of heat that's trapped in your body and the heat that can escape. Just like you would wear a thick coat in the winter to keep trap heat inside you, it has the same effect when you're playing sport, and that's pretty problematic if the weather's also challenging.
Well, that's really good. Sorry, go ahead, Blair.
Yeah, so interesting you bring up the NFL example. I often thought that NFL clothing is probably much better suited to playing in minus 10 degrees in Green Bay in January than it is to playing in 40 degrees in Phoenix in August. But the humidity point's an important one, and often the language around humidity is a bit confusing to people because most often people talk about relative humidity, but what that's about is that the amount of moisture that air is capable of holding is increases with temperature. Relative humidity is a percentage of the total possible. So, yeah, for example, if you look at, I was just looking at Darwin yesterday, for example, and first thing in the morning it was 24 degrees with a humidity of 90%, and then mid-afternoon it was 34 degrees with a humidity of 50%. But the actual amount of moisture in the atmosphere hasn't really changed. It's just that the maximum possible has increased because the temperature has increased. And I often tend to think more in terms of what we call the dew point, which is an indicator of the total amount of moisture in the atmosphere. And it's actually defined as what you have to cool the current air to get dew starting to form. And general rule of thumb there is that a dew point of over 20, which is probably fairly typical conditions for Brisbane in summer, is getting pretty humid. And when you're getting dew points up into the mid-20s, that's seriously humid. And one of the things to note this year is that you've got an Olympic Games happening in Tokyo right at the peak of summer, and Tokyo gets very humid in summer, and we'll probably see very high heat stress conditions with dew points in the mid-20s, even if the absolute temperatures are say high 20s or low 30s, so perhaps not as extreme as what we might get in the Australian summer.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, I just learned something really critical at point of the more robust measure of dew point versus relative humidity, because I'm just guessing, and I don't know, James, did the SMA, did they consult with the BOM or other climatologists to formulate the key indicators?
Yeah, so I'll just go back to what Blair was discussing there. Blair raises a really good point. There's a real misunderstanding of the way in which ambient temperature and humidity interact, and how that kind of governs our risk of heat stress. And with the SMA policy, that's something that we really tried to simplify. And we've done that in conjunction with the BOM. And we're directing the public to the BOM weather forecasts. And there they break down the temperature, and they make the relative humidity nicely accessible.
And
using that information, we've tried to break that down and simplify what that means in terms of an individual's level of heat stress. So we've tried to do the background work for the public, so it's nice and easy for them to interpret.
Great, thank you so much. Just a question to, I guess, all of you, and then as well, I'll be asking Greg some things, but you talk about, James, the specific sports and who's going to be affected more or less based off of a number of indicators. And then Blair, you've talked about locality and regional impact. Do you see that certain sports will be, if you had a list, that you were to make, and looking at the trends, the forecast of the next, say, 5 to 10 years, which sports must get on this policy, and considering climate and the people who play the sport in the list of order of like first, second, third in terms of priority? This sport must do this right now because it is the most immediate threat to them. And then next and next. So if you could do the top 5 sports.
Well, as I said, every sport's going to have its own risk profile, and that will depend on things like what its season is, how dependent it is on what types of facilities, and so on. So if you look, for example, at something like Australian rules football, which is primarily a winter sport. So heat exposure probably isn't a major issue for them, except maybe right at the start or end of the season in southern Australia. But drought is potentially a big risk for them at community level because of the impact it has on the availability of grounds. Whereas a sport like cricket, which is a summer sport, is obviously has a much higher level of exposure to extreme heat. Something else that comes into this, again, we see this perhaps more at a professional level, is sports moving outside their traditional seasonal window. For example, the AFL playing its women's competition in February and March, and so far they've got lucky. They haven't really had to play in an extreme heat wave, but one of these days that's going to happen. And how how does one cope with playing football in 40 plus degrees? It's quite challenging. Every sport's going to have its own risk profile there.
Yeah, thanks, Blair. Did you want to add that to that, James, based on profile of even the demographic of people playing as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Blair raises a really good point there with the notion of preparedness for unexpected heat events. So even though a sport may be typically held during the winter season, as we realize, these kind of surprise heat events are becoming more common, and the prevalence is going to continue to increase with climate change. So I think, as a general rule, all sports should have a basic heat plan in place that they can implement when needed, as kind of good practice.
Yeah.
And then just to kind of simplify the sports that are most likely to be riskier, you can really summarize that based on the activity intensity. So those higher intensity sports are going to be riskier to play in the heat, and also the sports where protective clothing is a requirement. Again, because they're the fundamentals of our heat balance during activity. So when we conducted the Sports Medicine Australia heat policy, we essentially rated all of the top 30, I think it was, sports participated in Australia. We rated them for typical intensity and typical clothing. And from that, we developed, they were awarded a score, and they fell into one of 5 different risk classifications. So based on our data, some examples of the riskiest sports include field hockey, fairly high intensity sport. The goalkeeper wears heavy protective pads. Cricket scored fairly high from a risk perspective. Again, fairly high intensity activity running between the wickets, and pretty cumbersome pads for the batsman make heat dissipation fairly challenging. And there were also some fairly surprising sports that fell into the high risk categories, such as equestrian. And people think, well, that's a little bit odd. But again, it's a fairly high intensity activity when you're on the horse, but also you're wearing cumbersome equipment, you're wearing full length jodhpurs, boots, a big helmet, which again makes heat dissipation challenging. But in the Sports Medicine Australia policy, we've broken down these sports into the different classifications, and they're easy for the readers to refer to and identify which risk classification they need to pay attention to.
That's so great. Thanks, James. And I appreciate you simplifying the discussion around clothing intensity, and as well, Blair talks about seasonality, but a lot of other risk factors that contribute to what would be in that list, I guess, in terms of the riskiest sports and that on the ranking. And that sounds like, Greg, something that would be really interesting as a research area, in sport management for the administrators who are thinking about how climate is changing for them and that being a risk area. Tell us about what research exists out there, if any, and if not, what we should be exploring now that we know all this great information from Blair and James.
Well, thanks for the question, Sheila. I think disappointingly that we're really only at the beginning of knowing what climate change means for it's. Now, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a scientist like James or Blair. So my job and the job of my colleagues, such as Madeleine, is to kind of translate the science into what it means for organisations and industries, and in this case, the sports industry. So the research is really at a pioneer stage, we might say. There's a really small number of papers around. Madeleine and I looked at, and some colleagues looked at recently, it's a professional sport and some of the research around that. And there's not a lot of research around. What we can say is a few things. So first of all, just to build on some of the comments that James and Blair made, one of the things that's probably helpful is to think about sports as either climate exposed or non-climate exposed, or maybe even less climate exposed. some researchers use that idea of climate exposure. And so a climate exposed sport is self-evident. It's sports that are outdoors, sports that are like football, baseball, tennis, horse racing, equestrian, we could add to that list. Those sorts of sports that are outdoors would most likely be at high risk. But those are indoors. It's maybe not that they have zero risk, but they have less risk. So those non-climate exposed sports might include ice hockey, gymnastics, basketball. Typically, those sorts of sports probably have less risk for both athletes and, as Blair's pointed out, for sports facilities as well. The other thing to think about in terms of climate risk is the idea of the pace with which the climate hazards kick in. So there's some researchers have developed this idea of both fast onset climate hazards and slow onset climate hazards. And that's quite useful, because what that helps to do is to help us think about, well, what are some of the risks and how we might respond to those risks. So for example, a fast onset risk might be a storm or a cyclone or a flood that's associated with those meteorological events. Bushfires might be another example of a fast onset climate event. And then there's slow onset events, which, like a drought. So they may take an extended period of time, but nevertheless present serious consequences, which may feed into the heat risks that James has talked about. I think it also, climate, as Blair's pointed out, it's getting warmer, presents some challenges for organisations. Stadiums have got issues, although generally they've got a lot of resources, and so they can adapt pretty well. There appears to be some issues, at least in Australia, for around water, energy and waste issues. Extreme heat's problematic for athletes, as we can see. It's also probably problematic for officials. Spectators is another group of people where the risk is present, and it may be interesting to hear James's and Blair's thoughts on this. So if you think about the Australian Open tennis tournament each year, it's held in January, which is a hotter part of the year in Southern Australia. Spectators there, as well as players, they're at risk from these extreme temperatures, if not high humidity. Facilities have got issues with fast onset hazards, flood damage. I think of some of those stadiums that have been flooded in recent years. Typhoon Hagibis in Japan in 2019 interrupted the Rugby World Cup. Now, that's an example of a fast onset risk. But that's probably some of the flavour of what's going on at the moment. Maybe towards the end, I might come back and make some summary comments.
Yeah. Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, and of course, it's it's important for sporters, for any business or activity, to understand its risk exposure in the present climate, even before you step up to considering climate change. And something like the typhoon example, you mentioned in Japan, Greg, but there's nothing particularly unusual about typhoons happening in Japan at that time of year, and perhaps they should have thought about that a bit more when they decided what time of year to schedule the event for.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, Blair, because, I feel, and it's interesting because each of you have different angles of the same issue, but when we'll learn to sort of take in consideration all of those factors as one umbrella. So what you're just saying in terms of they must consider not just the athletes who are playing, but then Greg talked about the place of play, and then as well the weather at that place of play.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned spectators, and that apart from the safety issues, that's potentially important for the commercial success of sporting events as well. If spectators are going to have an uncomfortable experience, they're probably not going to turn up.
That's right, completely. And in fact, it reminds me of one of our resources we just released was on the mitigation adaptation factors and the suggestions for community sport. And it does break it down into those three things, like people, organization, so commercial viability and risks and so on reputationally. And then thirdly, the place, the infrastructure and the facility and space and how climate's affecting it. But to that point, the relationship between people and the facility, can I ask you, and I'm being a bit cheeky, but like, Greg, you made a good point about exposure as like a kind of indicator or like an attribute or something that you would characterize a sport to be. And I noticed, like James, in the SMA, a lot of the sports you were talking about are all outdoors. And so both of you are agreeing that like there's less risk, at-risk sports. But like, I can't stop remembering the fact that when we had the bushfires and the smog went into that basketball court, and then people were affected by that. With heat, can that occur the same way? Like the envelope between the building and the outdoors, and having people indoors, that the conditions indoors being affected by what's happening outdoors, and creating an environment that can result in exertional heat.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And of course, we're not dismissing the risk for heat illness for indoor sports. The Sports Medicine Australia policy was designed primarily for outdoor sports, because as Greg alluded to, the risk is higher, partly because of the solar radiation with the sun. That provides quite a strong heating effect. But people exercising indoors can also heat up considerably, especially during high intensity exercise, as I alluded to earlier. And let's not forget, you can observe pretty warm temperatures indoors too. And you're right, these are more common in the summer. If it's hot outside, it's more likely to be hot indoors. But I guess the advantage with lots of these indoor facilities is the availability of air conditioning, which drastically reduces the risk. Of course, that's not available across the board, but it's in places such as Australia, it's fairly common for these indoor sports facilities to be air conditioned. Of course, it's not particularly sustainable. And from a climate change perspective, it's certainly a consideration, especially if us as a nation are making efforts to cut our emissions and kind of turn the tide with regard to climate change. So that's another pertinent consideration, I think.
Which is also an interesting point you made, James, because I'm guessing, like people's sports responses might be, oh my God, we have to go indoors now. And so like that does then increase the potential of then using more AC. I mean, not considering the fact that communities might not have access to that, but the drive of sports indoors because of climate will then exacerbate, the conditions, weather and because of the emissions from the energy use, et cetera.
I think this is maybe a good point just to highlight some of the cooling strategies that we advise as part of the Sports Medicine Australia policy. Because these were designed for outdoor use, they tend to not involve the need for air conditioning. They tend to be more sustainable, and they can equally be applied to the indoor setting. So some of the things that we recommend include kind of the ingestion of cold fluids that can be done indoors or outdoors. The use of ice vests or ice packs to actively cool the body, the use of kind of water sprays to externally wet the skin, enhance kind of evaporation from the skin. That's really effective in keeping us cool. And again, that can be done indoors and outdoors. So there's bits of the policy that can be drawn from and are as equally as relevant to indoor sports.
Yeah, no, thank you, James. Thanks for highlighting that. Blair, did you want to say something? It sounded like
just to note that when we talk about indoor facilities, as you say, those can be air conditioned, but in a lot of places they aren't, particularly in places that have historically had cool climates. So that may require sports facilities to invest further in cooling. I know I've been in some awfully stifling indoor stadiums in Europe in summer.
No, Blair, that's so relevant, because even this last year, I know from where you're from, James, England, it was so hot. They had a really hot summer for some reason, a time they didn't expect. And lots of those homes don't have air conditioning because typically they wouldn't have necessarily, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right. The adaptability of the existing infrastructure is a good point. Thanks, Blair.
I thought it was interesting, Greg highlighted the Australian Open as an organisation that could be affected, or an event that could be affected by extreme heat. And a couple of years ago, Tennis Australia as an organisation contacted our lab and asked us to develop a specific heat policy for the Australian Open tennis tournament. So I think Tennis Australia were one of the first major organisations to kind of approach heat from this perspective and acknowledge that they needed a formal evidence-based heat policy, which we now conduct for them on an annual basis. So we make the decisions as to when it's safe for the players to play as normal, when additional breaks are required, or even when the roof on Margaret Court Arena needs to be closed if conditions dictate. And I think in the context of climate change, it's certainly our hope that more major sports organisations and sports bodies will wake up to the need for these evidence-based policies and almost follow suit and try and engage with people, labs like ours, to produce these policies.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting, James, because there was a question for you, James, but I think Greg should answer the second part of it, which is, I'm just looking at the chat box here from Sandra, who's asked about the uptake of the guidelines and implementation of that. So if you could tell us if you know of any sports who have done, or what's what's been happening in terms of voluntary uptake. But then Greg, what are the types of things that we can do to help sports to access these types of professionals and the science to help them create a science-based profile? Sandra was saying, is that, does this need to go towards a mandatory approach? So James, what's the uptake? And Greg, what's the approach to get sports to engage with the science?
Yeah, so from an uptake perspective, it's a little bit tricky as the policy was only launched a couple of months ago, so it's still all kind of being rolled out and people are still engaging with it. But I can kind of say that the general feedback has been great. People, I think, appreciate the accessibility of it and how it's kind of broken down fairly complex concepts and made those understandable and implementable at a community sport level. We're going to continue to kind of engage with various stakeholders over the next few months, and we welcome any feedback about the policy, because this is going to be a dynamic policy that we hope can be kind of further improved as we move on.
Thanks, James. And Greg?
Just to go to Giorgio's question, it's a really interesting one. I think what types of measures are national federations taking to tackle these risks? I think the first thing that should be noted is that national sports organisations, tennis is a good example, but there are others. Cricket is another here in Australia. These organisations are taking on the advice of exercise physiologists specialising in heat stress, people like James and Sports Medicine Australia. They are paying attention to the SMA guidelines on heat policy. So that's the first thing that they're doing, particularly those that are played in the hotter parts of the year, those that are summer sports, but the winter sports are also doing it. So I think that's the first thing they're doing. These organisations do take the health of their participants and their officials seriously. I think from a strategic point of view, I think what sport organisations can and should do is first of all think about their degree of climate exposure. If they're outdoors, well, they've really got something to think about in the longer term. As Blair has pointed out, we're facing higher temperatures over multiple decades, really. And so that tends to increase the risk profile of a lot of sports. Now, it's complicated, the duration of sports, the intensity, relative humidity, ambient temperature, and all of those things, they do complicate things. But I think generally what sports organisations should be thinking about is adaptation plans. And those adaptation plans need to have a couple of characteristics. One is that they need to be location specific. So the adaptation plan for a sport in Melbourne might look different to the adaptation plan to a sport that's played in a tropical climate like Darwin or Miami or somewhere like that. The adaptation plan in San Francisco might look different to the one that's in Miami. So I think location specific plans are important. I think they also need to be sport specific. So the adaptation plan for tennis played in Melbourne might look different to the adaptation plan for tennis in Miami or a tropical climate like Cairns. So I think we need really targeted adaptation plans. And that takes time. You need to spend the time thinking about risks, identifying them, and then matching them to the particular profile of your sport. That's probably, I think, the thing that organisations need to do in the longer term.
I think that sport-specific adaptation approach is beneficial for a number of reasons. Firstly, it will better protect the athletes from the risks of heat illness, as it better captures the demands and the needs of those sports. But equally important from a sports organisation perspective, it will minimise unnecessary disruption. We don't want to be cancelling sport when it's unnecessary. People need to play sport. The benefits of that are well established. And from a business perspective, it's important that sport goes ahead when it can go ahead. And I think by tailoring your heat policy to your individual sport really helps achieve that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Greg, you've triggered, I would agree, the policy, as well as James has mentioned, that is sport specific, but as well for Blair, knowing the forecast of how climate will be changing, how often do you think the sport specific policy should be reviewed and updated to match what's changing in terms of the trajectory of the climate? Is it, do they need to look at it every year because climate's changing every year, or is it every 5 years, or what would be a good sort of
Well, I think if if you're up with the latest information and you're in a position to consider the full envelope of risks now, you probably don't need to be updating that often. Every 5 to 10 years is probably enough. But to do that, you do need to be cognizant of what your full range of risk exposure is now, even if it hasn't been realised. So you shouldn't just be assuming that next year is going to be like this year. You might get that one out of the box 1 in 20 or 1 in 50 year heat wave next year, and you need to understand what your risks are of that.
So you're saying yearly? Are you saying?
I think if you do it properly, you want it, doing it every 5 to 10 years is enough, but you do need to do it properly the first time.
Yeah, and base it in science, like James said, which is a critical thing, because it's really interesting because the science is available and the CSIRO BOM forecasting is there. It's a matter of people tapping into that and being able to then integrate, which is I guess I will encourage everyone to continue to put some questions in the chat box so we can continue this conversation. We do have a little less than 10 minutes. And if this panelists, if you guys have questions of each other, because how often do we get 4 great minds in one box to ask each other questions? Blair?
I think just picking up on the point I was making earlier, people's expectations get framed by what they've experienced quite recently, and we've had a relatively mild summer in most of southeastern Australia this year, and I think that could make some people think that what we saw the previous summer is something that happened a while ago, and they perhaps downplay the risk that you could get another summer like that, and you'll probably get summers like that more frequently than you would have historically.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Our mind sometimes plays tricks on us with all our biases of recency effect, and they're like, oh well, we don't think the bigger picture. Great point, really good point. Which is another good area of research, Greg, the psychology.
Well, I think Anthony Lezowitz's work at Yale on climate change communication is a really interesting thing for sports people to look at. The Six Americas study, which is updated annually, gives us some real clues as to how people think about climate. They do think about it in different ways, and there's different psychological factors that affect that. But I was just going to make just one final point just about the complexity of adapting to climate change. Now, one of the things that is not well understood by the public is climatic differences. And what people like Blair tend to do is they create these climate zones. So to help kind of make the weather understandable. So for example, the weather in southern Australia and the southeast corner of Australia is typically a temperate climate zone. But then, there's arid and semi-arid zones as you move towards closer to desert areas. There's subtropical climate zones, there's tropical climate zones, there's monsoonal tropical climate zones. So one of the things that will feed into, in my estimation, adaptation planning is the climate zone you live in.
Yeah.
For example, Blair, you mentioned earlier the Green Bay Packers in the NFL. Yeah. They live in a, well, I'm guessing it's kind of some kind of temperate climate zone or maybe subarctic. I'm not sure. It's pretty cold.
Yeah.
Now,
it's pretty hot in summer.
But the adaptation plan for a professional football team in that part of the world is going to look different to the adaptation plan for somewhere like Tampa Bay, which is a tropical climate. And I think that's one thing that needs to factor into adaptation planning. And again, that's going to take time.
Thanks, Greg, for that summary. And I think it's fantastic to be able to hear from the three of you. We do have a few minutes left, so if anyone wants to sneak in another question, but I think just understanding the science. Thanks, Blair, just giving us that background and the foundation so people understand how that is going to be an area of importance. To you, James, thank you for highlighting the key areas of the SMA report and guidelines for us to be able to understand how that change in climate is going to impact on sports and specifically on different types of sport. And just have to say, you make me, you remind me of the, what's that, it was the Smiling Mind person. Is it the Smiling Mind? You're sort of like lulling us into a meditative state with the way that you speak and what you were saying. It was great. Thank you so much. I feel so zen. And then as well, Greg, just applying that in a practical term, in practical terms for the sport industry, because you're of course part of the SEG group, taking research to then bring it out to the public.